So it's a great pleasure now to introduce our first keynote speaker of the morning, who is Claudia Baranzelli. Many of you know Claudia because she's from the DG Joint Research Center, and she's going to make a presentation on the territorial reference scenario for the future of Europe. Please join me in welcoming Claudia. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. I apologize in advance for my voice. I hope it's still intelligible today, so let's hope. Well, I'll start. Okay, so today with this presentation I would like to share with you what is, really briefly, the contribution of the Joint Research Center to the territorial agenda. As you may or may not know, our modeling platform called Louisa is explicitly mentioned together with ESPON in the tool number 33 of the Better Regulation Toolbox of the European Commission. So today I'll speak not only about scenario-based projections, but I'll try to briefly explain you also how we get there. So what is the territorial knowledge base that is behind, mentioning a few examples of historical analysis. And if time allows, I'll also briefly mention our dissemination strategies for the data and the analysis that we produce. So let's start from some definitions. So what's a territorial reference scenario? It can be understood as a baseline scenarios, so sort of benchmark against which we can compare different alternative scenarios or alternative policy options. It assumes the most likely socioeconomic trends, and this is really, really important because this is a tool that is used by several policy DGs in Brussels. So we have to agree with them, we take on board the European Commission assumptions on future economic and demographic outlook. Amongst several sources, one of the most important one is the ECFIN Aging Report. And the few examples that you see in this presentation, they all refer to the latest available aging report. Actually, just a week or so ago, we got the news that ECFIN finalized the new economic and demographic outlook. So now we are already starting to update our reference scenario in the coming, which will be available in the coming months. We take on board also the expected effect of European policies which have a known territorial dimension. Cohesion policies, the CAP for the agricultural sector, TNT for transport, and so on and so forth. And in this way, we're able to capture and to analyze the cross-sectoral impacts and interaction between different policies at different spatial scale, as we'll see in a minute. In order to get to these results, we have to rely on a rather vast underpinning knowledge base, which is composed by two main components. On one hand, we have a regional socioeconomic database, which cover both historical period and projections. These are economic variables and indicators such as GDP or employment. Depending on the indicator, the data date back to 1980s until today, and then projections up to normally 2030, in some cases 2050. The second component of the knowledge base is I would say humongous geographical database, which gives us information on where economic activities are located, where services are present across the territory, morphological information about the territorial, the European territory, etc. And all these, the reference scenario in its default configuration, it's updated on an yearly basis in order to take on board major updates. Just to give you some examples of input data that is behind our approach, we have a very nice representation of a social infrastructure distribution across Europe, so the exact geographic location of where, for instance, hospitals or schools are located. We have a very accurate representation of transport infrastructure for both road and railways. Same goes for the energy infrastructure. Lately, we have been investing a bit more time in collecting and harmonizing data on buildings and households at municipal and sub-municipal level whenever possible. And as I mentioned before, long-time series of socioeconomic parameters. We are also trying to complement these traditional data sources with crowdsourced and big data. Yesterday, this topic was briefly mentioned. And we go from very high resolution satellite imagery to personal weather stations that we use to monitor the microclimate in urban areas, social media, and of course all the services that Google makes at disposal. So why do we need all these tools? I'm sorry that the titles are cut from the slides because they're an integral part of the presentation, but I'll do my best. Because, as we all know, European regions are widely diverse. And so if we want to assess the local and regional impacts of European policies in a meaningful way, we do have to take into account that physical features, socioeconomic, demographic, and environmental characteristics are all specific to their location and their regional context. So we have to be able to work across different spatial scales, from the very local one up to the national scale. Here I have just a simple example, a straightforward example to exemplify this concept of working across different dimensions, but I will not spend time here. What we're looking is basically for the coming 10 years, the expected population changes across Europe at national, NUTS 2 level, NUTS 3 level, down to the geographical location of the changes, which I'm not seeing in the presentation. I need some technical assistance.
What are you
right. All right. Sorry. In order to make use to all these tools that we have at disposal, in the last year we have dedicated quite some time to analyze major European trends, looking at both historical periods and projections, reference projections. And we have dedicated quite some time to the analysis of determinants of regional and urban growth. We've been looking at regional competitiveness. We're really interested in demography and urbanization, and of course also quality of life, for which we have developed both a regional and urban indicator. Starting from determinant of growth, if we look at the past 10 years of data, so from 2000 to 2040, again it was in the title, but it got cut, we can indeed identify few variables that can explain 80% of the variance that we have in our data, such as initial GDP per capita, share of working population with different education attainments, and so on and so forth. And of course, we can also concentrate a bit more on the effect of specific variables. And for instance, if we think about spatial spillovers, we can indeed map GDP growth at regional level across Europe and clearly identify two big clusters of regions with either high or low growth. In the first case, neighboring regions self-reinforce their growth. In the second case, they negatively affect their reciprocal growth. And when we talk about competitiveness, again, we can select few key variables, such as employment shares, GDP per capita, or young dependency ratio, and analyze the past 10 years of data to see how changes evolved. So starting from 2000, going to 2005, we can identify across Europe a general upward development trend. So low and medium competitiveness regions tend to improve their performance. until 2010, this upward trend continues, but slowing down, until 2014, when the negative impacts of the economic downturns are clearly visible. And this is another example that we have been working on, analyzing the role of cities in the economic growth. Here, the main message is that not all metropolitan regions are equal. So whether we consider capital, second tier, or smaller metro regions, the behavior is quite different. And this has important policy implication, because a kind of one-size-fits-all of policy will not work. So far, we have been talking about historical trends, historical data. Here we're looking at projections, so again, the coming 15 years. And yet again, if we look at demographic changes across Europe, it becomes clear that location matters. For instance, not all cities across Europe behave in the same way, but for instance, depending whether they are located in core regions or peripheral regions, they behave rather differently, losing or gaining population. And this has important repercussions if we want to assess the effectiveness of European policies. Think, for instance, the investments in infrastructures. Their main objective is to increase potential accessibility of the entire European territory. But in order to do so, we cannot just consider the amount of money that is invested in the physical infrastructures. We do have to take into account how population distribution will likely change in the future. Otherwise, we will provide a biased outcome and results. And of course, once we have set our reference scenario, it becomes really interesting to play with alternatives, with policy options. Here we're looking at an example that DG Regio asked us to work on, convergence scenario, based on the hypothesis that GDP per capita and productivity will converge in the long term. And of course, we can design alternative policy options, also keeping in mind specific performances or specific topics, such as the quality of life in cities. And here we're looking at an example on the air quality and level of population exposed to pollutants concentration levels above the legal limits. So here it becomes really interesting to play and to combine different technological assumptions, different likely population or urbanization patterns, and then understand what could be the potential role of, for instance, local planning instruments in order to counteract or better to ameliorate the performance of cities, for instance, regarding air quality and quality of life. So as I promised, I'll conclude my presentation mentioning how we disseminate data and the output of our analysis. So far, we have developed two main web platforms. One, the Territorial dashboard, is dedicated to regional data, meaning from NUTS 0, so from country level, down to NUTS 3 level. And the urban data platform, which is instead dedicated to disseminate data on cities, different aggregation levels, so cities, metropolitan areas of different types, and so on and so forth. In both cases, we provide mapping tools and interactive charts that any user can download and use. And of course, the actual data behind can as well be downloaded. We have now plans to merge these two platforms in one, and we also have ongoing talks with other Commission services, such as Eurostat, to investigate the possibility of interlinking our respective platforms in order to provide one consistent service to our users, which are of course, any type of stakeholders, policymakers, and of course also the citizens. So I invite you to explore the data and the analysis that we make available through these platforms. Please download the data and, if you wish, give us your feedback. Thank you.
Great.